To the staff at St. Jude's Memorial Hospital, I am simply known as Old Marge. I am the 68-year-old retired head nurse who spent 40 years walking the cold linoleum floors of the oncology ward. They see an old woman who still uses the city bus, wears comfortable orthotic shoes, and buys her practical trench coats from the local thrift shop. Every Thursday afternoon, I return to the hospital as a volunteer, carrying a heavy woven basket filled with homemade chicken broth and fresh lemon biscuits for the long-term patients who have no families left to visit them. For 4 decades, I lived by a simple, unyielding code. Medicine is not a business. It is a sanctuary for the broken. I have held the hands of billionaires and unhoused souls in their final moments. And under the harsh fluorescent lights of the intensive care unit, their blood runs the exact same shade of red. The machines don't care about the balance in your bank account, and death does not accept a corporate credit card. My son, Ethan, grew up playing with my old stethoscopes on our small kitchen table. I raised him alone on a nurse's modest salary, stretching every dollar to ensure he had the best textbooks and the highest quality education. He inherited my steady hands and my sharp, clinical mind. But somewhere between his residency and his first $1 million corporate contract, Ethan stopped looking at patients as human beings in need of healing. He started looking at them as balance sheets. Right now, if you drive down the upscale medical district of the city, you cannot miss his face. He is Dr. Ethan Vance, the Chief Medical Director of Vance Aesthetic Institute, a hyper-exclusive, multi-million-dollar plastic surgery clinic that caters to Hollywood celebrities, tech heiresses, and high society wives. He charges $10,000 just for a 45-minute consultation. He no longer operates on cancer patients. He operates on the vanity of the wealthy, and he has completely forgotten the woman who paid for his first scalpel. The transformation of my son became permanent the day he married Vanessa Cross. Vanessa was a high-profile philanthropy influencer, a woman who had built an audience of 3 million followers by organizing lavish, star-studded charity galas. Galas where the cost of the flower arrangements usually exceeded the actual amount of money raised for the cause. To Vanessa, charity wasn't about relieving human suffering. It was a high society runway, a branding exercise designed to secure corporate sponsorships and media features. When Ethan and Vanessa bought their $10 million penthouse overlooking Central Park, they invited me over for a brief, scheduled Sunday lunch. I wore my neatest navy blue Sunday dress, the one I had ironed with care, and brought a small container of my organic elderberry syrup to help with Ethan's chronic sinus issues. Vanessa didn't even allow the container to touch her Italian quartz kitchen island. She picked it up with the tips of her manicured fingers and immediately handed it to her uniformed housemaid. "Marge, sweetie." Vanessa had sighed, her voice dripping with artificial warmth. "We strictly use customized, medical-grade vitamin infusions, curated by a private wellness laboratory in Switzerland. Hand-poured syrups in repurposed glass jars just don't align with the toxic-free, minimalist lifestyle brand we are projecting for Ethan's upcoming campaign. If his high-net-worth clients see this kind of rustic clutter in the penthouse, it completely derails the elite medical narrative." Ethan sat right across from me, cutting into his imported Wagyu steak. He didn't look up from his phone. He didn't tell her that, when he was 12 years old and suffering from a severe case of bronchitis, that exact elderberry syrup was the only thing that kept his throat open through the freezing winter nights. He just nodded smoothly, his eyes locked on his digital schedule. "Vanessa's right, Mum," he said carelessly. "We have to maintain a certain standard of living now. The medical board is watching my profile very closely. I'm up for the Chief of Surgery nomination at the hospital's new $50 million oncology pavilion next week. We can't afford any domestic distractions." The magnificent, terrifying joke of Ethan's high society medical career was currently locked in a secure steel safety deposit box at the downtown branch of Vanguard Trust. My son truly believed he was the master of his universe. He believed his pristine reputation, his high-profile celebrity clients, and Vanessa's glitzy social media campaigns were the sole reasons the hospital board was considering him for the prestigious position of head of oncology at the new state-of-the-art research wing. He believed he had outgrown the simple, low-income nurse who raised him. He had completely forgotten that hospitals do not run on vanity. They run on massive institutional capital, and he had no idea who was actually building that $50 million pavilion. I stood up from my small armchair on Elm Street, looking out the window at the old oak tree in my yard. In exactly 48 hours, St. Jude's Hospital was hosting its annual winter charity gala, a $5,000 a ticket event where the wealthiest families in the state would gather to witness the formal announcement of the anonymous donor who had single-handedly funded the new oncology center. Ethan and Vanessa had bought a front-row VIP table, intending to use the flashing cameras to cement his status as the new king of the hospital. I took a quiet, slow sip of my herbal tea. The equation of my son's life had become heavily corrupted by gilded lies and stolen pride. He had traded his medical compass for a luxury brand, and as a woman who spent 40 years keeping patients alive, I knew that when a system becomes infected with toxic tissue, you don't ignore it. You have to pick up the scalpel and cut it out entirely. To my son, Ethan, my 40 years of nursing were nothing but a proof of financial failure. He looked at my small apartment, my thrift store coats, and my public transit passes, and he calculated a life of poverty. He truly believed that the only way to escape the struggle of my existence was to charge $10,000 a pop, just to alter the faces of Manhattan's elite. But Ethan's math was completely wrong. He confused a humble choice with a financial limitation. My grandfather, Dr. Silas Avery, was one of the premier research physicians of the mid-20th century. He didn't care about fame, but he cared deeply about science. In the 1960s, he developed a foundational synthetic compound, a compound used today in nearly 30% of all modern chemotherapy treatments worldwide. When he passed, he didn't leave behind a flashy mansion. He left behind a private, tightly locked family medical trust, registered as the Avery Vance Endowment. When I married Ethan's father, we made a silent covenant. We would never use a single dime of that generational wealth for personal luxury. I didn't want a penthouse or a private jet. I wanted to serve. I chose to work the grueling, 12-hour shifts in the oncology ward because I wanted to look my patients in the eye and know their pain, entirely uncorrupted by the weight of a massive fortune. When Ethan was in medical school, he used to complain about his cheap apartment. "Mum," he had said one night over a plate of frozen dinner, "look at Dr. Sterling's son. His family bought him a luxury condo right next to the campus. Why do we have to live so tight? Didn't you save anything?" I had smiled smoothly, pouring him a glass of water. "Ethan," I told him softly, "true medical authority is not measured by the view from your condo. It's measured by the weight of your knowledge. When a patient's life is hanging by a single thread, focus on the medicine. The foundation will appear when the storm hits." He had no idea that every single semester, his tuition, his high-end lab fees, and his private research grants were being quietly paid for by an anonymous academic scholarship fund, a fund fully capitalized by the Avery Vance Endowment. I wanted him to remain hungry for knowledge, not entitled to luxury. 3 years ago, St. Jude's Memorial Hospital reached a catastrophic breaking point. Their state-of-the-art oncology research lab was facing a complete shutdown due to federal budget cuts and a total lack of corporate funding. The very ward where I'd spent 40 years saving lives was about to be liquidated and turned into a private healthcare business. I couldn't let that happen. A sanctuary cannot be turned into a shopping mall. I called an emergency, midnight meeting with our longtime family estate attorney and the chief financial officer of the hospital's board. Under absolute, legally binding non-disclosure agreements, I authorized a direct, unilateral grant of $50 million from the Avery Vance Endowment to completely fund the construction of a brand new, world-class oncology pavilion. My conditions were completely non-negotiable. First, the donation must remain entirely anonymous to the public. Second, the pavilion must prioritize low-income families who couldn't afford advanced cancer therapies. And finally, the Avery Vance Endowment would retain a permanent 100% absolute veto power over the appointment of the pavilion's chief of surgery. I built that pavilion as a monument to true healing, and in the deepest, most hopeful corner of my mother's heart, I had built it for Ethan. He was a brilliant resident back then, before Vanessa Cross re-engineered his mind. I had secretly hoped that one day, when he had proven his character and his dedication to human life, I would spin that boardroom chair around, hand him the keys to the multi-million-dollar research facility, and say, "Go save the world, son. Your grandfather and I have already paid the bill." But wealth has a terrifying way of rotting a fragile mind. The moment Ethan met Vanessa, his focus shifted from the operating room to the red carpet. Vanessa convinced him that curing cancer was a low-margin, high-stress dead end. She showed him that by opening a luxury clinic, he could make 50 times the money, with 0% of the emotional trauma. He abandoned his oncology research. He turned his back on the sick children and the desperate mothers of St. Jude's to spend his days performing facelifts and Botox injections for vanity-driven socialites. And yet, his greed was insatiable. When the hospital announced the upcoming completion of the new $50 million pavilion, Ethan saw an opportunity, not for service, but for ultimate prestige. Vanessa realized that if Ethan could secure the title of chief of surgery while maintaining his multi-million-dollar private clinic, it would make him the most powerful medical figure in the state. It would validate her brand. For the past 6 months, Ethan and Vanessa had been aggressively lobbying the hospital board, spending hundreds of thousands of dollars hosting private dinners for the trustees, completely oblivious to the fact that the anonymous donor they were trying to impress was currently scrubbing soup pots in the volunteer kitchen downstairs. I stood up from my desk, walking over to the safe in my closet to retrieve the original, wet ink executed endowment contract. In exactly 24 hours, the winter charity gala would begin. Ethan truly believed he had purchased the trustees' votes with his flashy dinners and his wife's social media influence. He believed his ascension to the throne was a mathematical certainty. I ran my thumb over the gold leaf seal of the Avery Vance endowment. The equation of my son's medical career had become completely corrupted by gilded lies. He wanted the glory of the crown without the sacrifice of the cross. But as a head nurse who had spent 40 years maintaining balance in the intensive care unit, I knew that an infected limb cannot be reasoned with. You have to prep the field, sterilize the tools, and cut it out before the rot reaches the heart. The grand ballroom at the Plaza Hotel was a roaring sea of absolute luxury. It was the night of the winter charity gala, and the snow-dusted sidewalk outside was lined with rolling red carpets, flashing paparazzi cameras, and a continuous stream of black limousines. Women in custom silk gowns and men in tailored Italian tuxedos moved gracefully up the stone steps, laughing under the heavy crystal chandeliers. I arrived by the city bus, walking the final 2 blocks in the chilling evening rain. I wore my neat, ironed navy blue Sunday dress and my old, grey wool trench coat, the one I had purchased from the thrift shop 3 winters ago. In my hands, I carried a small, carefully packed basket containing 3 jars of fresh, homemade vegetable broth and a batch of warm lemon biscuits. I had promised the late-stage patients in the long-term ward that I would bring them a small comfort before the night ended. As I stepped into the grand foyer, the warmth of the room hit my face, along with the scent of expensive perfume and vintage champagne. I looked across the crowded ballroom and instantly spotted my son, Ethan. He looked magnificent, standing beside a group of the hospital's primary trustees, laughing smoothly, a crystal glass of scotch in his hand. Vanessa stood right next to him, wearing a dazzling emerald green designer gown, her diamond necklace catching every flash of the media cameras. They were the absolute center of attention, the golden couple of the medical elite. I began walking toward them, intending to simply say a quiet hello and wish Ethan luck before the board announced the new chief of surgery. But before I could even cross the polished marble floor, Vanessa's eyes locked onto me. I watched the fake, calculated smile melt instantly from her face, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated horror. She violently tapped Ethan's shoulder, pointing a manicured nail in my direction. Ethan turned his head, and as his eyes met mine, I saw a flash of deep, agonizing embarrassment cross his face. He quickly set his drink down, grabbed Vanessa by the wrist, and marched rapidly across the room, intercepting me before I could get anywhere near the hospital trustees or the flashing cameras of the press line. They pulled me into a secluded alcove, hidden behind a massive, towering floral arrangement, entirely away from the eyes of high society. "Marge, what on earth are you doing here?" Vanessa hissed, her voice a sharp, desperate whisper, her eyes scanning the room frantically to ensure no journalists were watching. "Look at you. You are soaking wet. You are wearing an old, pilled thrift store coat, and you are carrying a wooden picnic basket in the middle of a $5,000 a ticket gala. Are you trying to destroy our reputation?" I looked at my son, waiting for him to speak, waiting for him to remind his wife that the woman standing before them had spent 40 years serving this exact hospital. But Ethan did not defend me. He looked down at his polished leather shoes, then looked back up, his voice cold and entirely detached. "Mom, Vanessa is right," Ethan muttered, rubbing his temples in frustration. "This is the most important night of my corporate career. The major network cameras are broadcasting live. The Vogue journalists are doing a feature on us. If a media photographer snaps a picture of my mother looking like a low-income volunteer, it destroys the entire elite narrative we've spent months building. It makes it look like I don't care about my own family. It makes us look cheap." I stood perfectly still, holding my small basket of soup, listening to the classical music hum in the background. The warmth of the ballroom suddenly felt freezing cold. My son had completely calculated my value and decided that his mother was nothing but a public relations liability. He had traded the truth of where he came from for the shiny gloss of a temporary brand. "I came to wish you luck, Ethan," I said softly, my voice steady and completely devoid of anger. "And to deliver this to the patients downstairs." Vanessa let out a sharp, mocking chuckle, tossing her styled hair over her shoulder. "The patients can eat the hospital food. Marge, right now, you need to step away from the VIP area. You are an absolute inconvenience to our table." Vanessa reached out her manicured hand, her heavy diamond ring flashing under the dim alcove light, and snatched my gold-embossed VIP invitation card right out of my fingers. "You won't be needing this front row pass, Marge," she whispered, her eyes gleaming with a malicious, calculated satisfaction. She handed the card to a young, nervous event coordinator standing nearby. "Reassign her. Put her at table 42, in the back storage corridor, right next to the service entrance and the public restrooms. She'll be much more comfortable with the wait staff." I looked at Ethan, my son, the boy I had raised on a head nurse's modest salary, stood there like a total coward, pretending to adjust his pristine silk bow tie. He refused to meet my eyes. "It's for the best, Mom," Ethan murmured, his voice dropping into a desperate, strained whisper. "The front row is strictly reserved for the major hospital board members and high-net-worth investors. If the media cameras catch you sitting there in that thrift store coat, it will raise too many questions. It will ruin the branding for my nomination. Just go to the back. Please, don't make a scene." I didn't argue. I didn't say a single word. I quietly turned around and walked away from the glittering center of the ballroom, down the long, dim hallway, past the sweeping marble columns, until the classical music became nothing but a distant, hollow hum. Table 42 was a small, unadorned wooden table, tucked away in a drafty corner, right next to the heavy swinging doors of the industrial kitchen and the public restrooms. The air smelled of strong chemical bleach and discarded banquet food. I sat down alone, placing my small, woven basket of soup on the empty white tablecloth. While my son sat at a $10,000 table surrounded by billionaires, his mother was placed next to the trash cans. An hour into the event, the heavy service doors flew open, and Vanessa marched down the hallway, surrounded by a small entourage of young, wealthy socialites. Her smartphone was held high in her hand, the attachable ring light casting a harsh, unnatural glow over her face. She was running a live broadcast to her 3 million social media followers, showcasing the glamour and the exclusivity of the winter charity gala. Then she spotted me. Her eyes lit up with a cruel, viral inspiration. She turned her camera, panning it over the bleak, drafty corridor, and walked right up to my table, her voice shifting into a high-pitched, theatrical performance. "Look at this, everyone." Vanessa cooed into the microphone, leaning over my shoulder as the live chat on her screen scrolled at lightning speed. Even at a $5,000 a ticket event, we still have room for the less fortunate. This is my husband's mother, Marge. She's an old, retired volunteer here. And look what she brought to a luxury gala. Without asking, Vanessa forcefully ripped the checkered cloth off my basket, exposing the 3 glass jars of homemade vegetable broth and the lemon biscuits. She picked up a jar with a look of exaggerated disgust, holding it right in front of the camera lens for millions of people to see. "Homemade slop in a recycled glass jar?" Vanessa laughed, a sharp, cutting sound that echoed down the narrow hallway. "This is exactly what is wrong with the old, outdated generation of medicine. While my husband is out there saving lives with multi-million-dollar advanced aesthetic procedures, some people still think you can cure the world with unhygienic kitchen broth. It's almost sad, isn't it?" The socialites behind her chuckled, whispering to each other as they looked down at my worn trench coat. Vanessa set the jar back down with a loud, careless clack, turned her camera back to her own face, and walked away without looking back, leaving me in the dim, cold corridor. I sat in the quiet, looking at the small jar of broth. My son had allowed his wife to turn his own mother into a public laughingstock, a cheap prop for an online audience, all to protect his precious corporate brand. The equation was now completely finished. The variables were locked. I reached into my old trench coat pocket and pulled out my phone. It was time to introduce Dr. Ethan Vance to the true definition of a medical emergency. The grand ballroom was still echoing with distant laughter and the clinking of crystal glasses when I quietly stood up from table 42. I didn't stay to watch the lavish main course or the glittering speeches. I walked down the back service stairs, completely away from the high society crowd, and entered the dim, quiet basement corridors of St. Jude's Memorial Hospital. I walked into the long-term oncology ward, the place where I'd spent 40 years of my life. The air here didn't smell of expensive perfume. It smelled of medicine, antiseptic, and quiet endurance. I went room by room, delivering the fresh, warm vegetable broth and the homemade lemon biscuits to the lonely, elderly patients who had been completely forgotten by the glittering charity gala upstairs. I sat with them, held their thin, trembling hands, and watched the genuine warmth return to their eyes. This was the only sanctuary that mattered. This was true healing. At 11 p.m, I walked out of the hospital's back exit into the freezing, snow-dusted New York night. The cold wind bit through my old, grey wool trench coat, but my mind was completely clear. I stood under the rusted metal bus stop shelter, waiting for the final crosstown bus, while luxury black limousines sped past me, carrying billionaires back to their penthouses. When I returned to my small, quiet apartment on Elm Street, I didn't turn on the lights. I walked into my study, sat down at my late husband's old oak desk, and pulled out the leather-bound file of the Avery Vance endowment. Beneath the harsh light of my desk lamp, the gold leaf corporate seal of the trust gleamed with absolute, unyielding authority. 10 years ago, the hospital board had signed this contract in a state of total desperation. They had accepted $50 million, assuming the anonymous donor was just a passive, wealthy ghost who would never interfere with their corporate structure. They had completely forgotten paragraph 4, section 2 of the operating agreement. The text was bold, clear, and permanent. The Avery Vance endowment retains a permanent 100% absolute veto power over the appointment of the pavilion's chief of surgery. Any public announcement, corporate restructuring, or alteration of executive leadership without the prior, written authorization of the trust chairperson constitutes an immediate, irreversible material breach, rendering the entire $50 million funding block completely frozen, effective immediately. Ethan thought his $10,000 dinners and his wife's viral live streams had bought him the crown of St. Jude's. He truly believed that 68-year-old old Marge was just an inconvenient, low-income volunteer. He was about to learn that a foundation built on a gilded lie always collapses when the architect pulls the plug. I opened my secure, encrypted laptop on the desk. I inserted a heavy, metallic hardware security key that had been resting in a secret velvet lining inside my grandpa's old medical case. The screen flashed from crimson to a deep, steady green. Avery Vance Endowment Compliance Portal accessed. I pulled up the final, official agenda for the Winter Charity Gala, which was scheduled to broadcast its grand finale at exactly midnight. The hospital board, heavily influenced by Vanessa's wealthy family and Ethan's high-profile aesthetic clinic, had officially listed Dr. Ethan Vance as the exclusive, unanimous nominee for Chief of Surgery at the new research pavilion. They had completely omitted the contractually mandated veto rights of the endowment to make the hospital look completely autonomous to Wall Street investors. In medicine, if you misdiagnose the primary root of a disease, the treatment will always kill the patient. Ethan thought he was calculating a legacy of absolute power. In reality, he had just calculated his own professional execution. By bypassing the anonymous trust's approval, the hospital board hadn't just committed a minor administrative error. They had committed an institutional breach of contract. If the board attempted to announce Ethan's name on television, without my written consent, the entire $50 million funding grant would vanish from their accounts before the words could even leave the presenter's mouth. They wanted a world ruled by high-stakes business, corporate optics, and cold, calculated branding. It was time to give them exactly what they asked for. I picked up my old, traditional landline phone. I dialed a private, unlisted number that I hadn't used in nearly 3 years. It was 11:45 p.m. on Thursday night. The line rang only once before a deep, sharp, incredibly authoritative voice answered. I've been watching the live charity broadcast on the network. Marcus Vance, our longtime family estate attorney, said, his voice completely alert and focused. The cameras are currently panning over the front row VIP tables. I noticed you were nowhere to be found near your son. I was wondering when you were going to call. My daughter-in-law confiscated my VIP pass. Marcus, I said, my voice completely level and entirely devoid of emotion. She reassigned me to table 42 in the back service hallway, right next to the public restrooms, and then she live-streamed my late husband's memory to millions of her followers, calling my volunteer work a public inconvenience. A long, heavy, freezing silence stretched over the telephone line. When Marcus spoke again, the professional warmth was completely gone, replaced by the razor-sharp, lethal tone of a senior litigator who had protected my grandfather's medical legacy for decades. She put you next to the restrooms, Marcus murmured, his voice dropping into a dangerous, low register. Which means they have officially violated the dignity clause of the endowment and bypassed the mandatory chairperson's sign-off for the surgery nomination. The legal loop is officially closed. What are your explicit instructions, Mrs. Vance? I looked at the gold leaf seal on the original contract resting on my desk. Activate the Avery Vance veto. Marcus, I commanded calmly. File an emergency, material non-compliance injunction with the hospital's Board of Trustees immediately. Send a formal electronic cease and desist copy directly to the compliance desk at the Gala's main broadcasting network. Tell them that the Avery Vance Endowment formally rejects the nomination of Dr. Ethan Vance. Consider it done, Marcus replied, the sound of computer keys clicking rapidly in the background, already audible. The automated compliance server will flag the hospital's treasury account within 4 minutes. By midnight, the Board of Trustees will be in a state of absolute, unadulterated panic. Do you want me to notify Ethan's legal team? No, I said, a faint, cold smile touching my lips as I looked out the window at the falling snow. Let Ethan enjoy his champagne for the next 15 minutes. Let him put on his best smile for the flashing cameras. I want him to experience the exact financial valuation of a gilded lie. I hung up the phone. I neatly closed the leather-bound file, placed it back into the steel safe, and locked the door. The equation was finally set. The variables were locked. And when the clock struck midnight in a few minutes, my son was finally going to learn how to heal. Midnight arrived with the heavy, dramatic toll of a grandfather clock, echoing somewhere in the grand lobby of the Plaza Hotel. Inside the ballroom, the lights slowly dimmed, leaving only a single, brilliant golden spotlight focused directly on the main stage. The classical orchestra melted into a low, suspenseful roll of drums. The chairman of the hospital's Board of Trustees, A powerful, silver-haired Wall Street tycoon named Dr. Arthur Sterling stepped up to the microphone. He smoothed his tailored tuxedo jacket, smiled widely for the network television cameras, and gripped the edges of the podium. "Ladies and gentlemen," the chairman's voice boomed through the high-end sound system. "We have reached the historic climax of our annual Winter Charity Gala. Tonight, we do not just celebrate the legacy of St. Jude's Memorial Hospital. Tonight, we look toward a future of absolute, unprecedented medical excellence. As many of you know, a private, anonymous medical endowment has spent the last 3 years single-handedly financing our brand-new $50 million oncology research pavilion. In the very front row, at the most expensive VIP table in the room, Ethan and Vanessa sat like royalty. Vanessa sat perfectly straight, her chin tilted upward, her emerald green gown shimmering under the ambient light. She had her smartphone positioned on a small tripod, running her live stream directly to her millions of followers, eager to capture the exact second her husband became the most powerful medical figure in the state. Ethan leaned back in his chair, a look of absolute, smug confidence etched onto his face. He adjusted his heavy, diamond-encrusted watch, completely convinced that the world was running exactly on his numbers. "The anonymous pavilion is now fully completed," the chairman continued, his voice building with theatrical excitement. "And the Board of Trustees, after extensive consultation with our primary stakeholders, is prepared to unanimously announce the brilliant mind who will lead this facility as our new Chief of Surgery. A man who represents the absolute pinnacle of modern, elite medicine." Right at that exact microsecond, before the chairman could utter Ethan's name, a strange, chaotic phenomenon occurred at the head table. It started with a single, sharp, aggressive vibration. The hospital's chief financial officer reached into his tuxedo pocket, pulling out his encrypted corporate phone. His eyes widened into circles of pure, unadulterated panic as he stared at a flashing, blood-red notification. Then, another phone buzzed, and another. Within 5 seconds, every single board member, trustee, and legal counsel sitting on the executive committee felt their devices explode with Priority 1 emergency compliance alerts. The rhythmic, chaotic buzzing of cellular devices began to echo across the front row, a digital alarm cutting directly through the high society glamour. The chairman on stage stopped mid-sentence, his mouth remaining slightly open as the hospital's chief financial officer practically sprinted up the wooden steps of the stage. The CMO didn't care about the live television broadcast or the billionaire audience. His face was entirely stripped of color, completely translucent with terror as he leaned over the podium, shoving a tablet directly into the chairman's hands. "Arthur, stop the announcement," the CFO whispered, his voice cracking violently, carrying straight into the sensitive live microphone. "The Treasury account, it's gone. The entire $50 million funding block has been completely pulled from the central ledger." The chairman's eyes darted down to the screen. The master banking portal for St. Jude's Hospital displayed a catastrophic, blinking status message: account status, unfunded, legal injunction active. Material breach detected per Avery, Vance Endowment Decree. A heavy, suffocating murmur rippled across the 1,000-seat ballroom. The elite guests began whispering to each other, pointing at the stage as the digital presentation screen behind the chairman suddenly glitched, turning from a beautiful image of the new research pavilion to a stark, frozen corporate warning logo. Ethan's smile froze on his face. He slowly leaned forward, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the edge of the mahogany table. "What is going on?" Vanessa whispered, her voice losing its high-pitched, theatrical influencer tone, replaced by a sharp, desperate panic. "Ethan, why did they stop the presentation? The cameras are turning away from us. Fix this. Why isn't he reading your name?" Before Ethan could answer, the chairman stepped back to the microphone, his hands trembling so violently that the papers in his grip rustled loudly over the audio system. Ladies and gentlemen," the chairman stammered, sweat pouring down his forehead. "Due to an unexpected, catastrophic compliance and regulatory freeze, the formal announcement for the chief of surgery position is hereby postponed, effective immediately. Will all members of the Executive Medical Committee and Dr. Ethan Vance report to the main boardroom right now?" The golden spotlight instantly shattered, the house lights flashing on with a harsh, blinding fluorescent clarity that stripped the room of all its romantic illusion. The multi-billion-dollar charity Gala had dissolved into an absolute, legal crime scene. Vanessa let out a sharp, choked scream as her live-stream chat exploded with thousands of messages mocking her, asking why the company was frozen. Ethan stood up so fast he knocked his crystal champagne flute to the floor, the glass shattering into a million tiny pieces against the marble. The tech prodigy, the sculptor of the elite, the self-made medical king, was suddenly standing in a room full of flashing cameras, entirely naked. The gilded lie had officially run out of numbers. The pristine, mahogany-lined corridors of the Plaza Hotel's executive wing felt like a pressure cooker. Ethan marched down the hallway, his expensive leather shoes slamming against the carpet, his hands clenched into tight fists. Vanessa sprinted right beside him, her emerald gown rustling loudly, her face completely distorted with panic, as her phone continuously buzzed with angry notifications from her sponsors. The live-stream disaster was spreading like wildfire across the internet. Their gilded world was beginning to burn. "This is a mistake, Ethan," Vanessa hissed, her voice trembling with high society rage. "My brand cannot be associated with a financial fraud investigation. My father's public relations team is already getting frantic calls from journalists. Who is the Avery Vance endowment? Who has the audacity to freeze $50 million right before my live stream peaked?" "I don't care who they are, Vanessa," Ethan roared, tearing open his silk bow tie, sweat dripping down his neck. "I am the most profitable plastic surgeon in this state. I have the trustees in my pocket. If some shadowy, anonymous investor thinks they can hijack my career on the eve of my victory, I will sue them into absolute bankruptcy. They don't know who they are messing with." They reached the heavy, double mahogany doors of the main executive boardroom, where the frantic murmurs of the hospital trustees could be heard from inside. Ethan didn't knock. He violently threw the doors open, letting them slam against the walls with a resounding crash. He was completely blind with a desperate, defensive rage. He spent the entire walk planning his counterattack, believing he was facing a corporate enemy, a ruthless competitor who had bought up the hospital's debt to blackmail him. He was prepared to threaten them, to use every legal weapon in his arsenal to crush this faceless saboteur. The boardroom was completely silent. The hospital trustees, including Dr. Arthur Sterling, were gathered around the 30-foot marble conference table, their faces pale, their eyes locked on the figure sitting at the far end of the room. Standing next to the high-backed leather chairperson's seat was Marcus Vance, our senior family estate attorney, his tailored suit immaculate, his expression completely cold. "Listen to me, Vance." Dr. Sterling, the chairman, stammered, stepping toward the attorney. "We have a legally binding partnership. You cannot pull $50 million out of our central registry without a 90-day corporate notice. This is financial sabotage. Where is the primary beneficiary of the Avery Vance endowment? Demand that they speak to us right now." "The primary beneficiary is already in the room. Arthur," Marcus said softly, his voice carrying the calm, absolute authority of a man holding all the cards. He stepped back and gently gestured to the leather executive chair. The high-backed chair slowly spun around. The words died instantly in Ethan's throat. His jaw went entirely slack, his eyes widening in a state of sudden, paralyzing shock that made him look like a frightened child. Sitting in the center of the multi-million-dollar boardroom was an old woman. She wore her faded, grey-knitted thrift store cardigan over her simple navy blue Sunday dress. Her hair, silver grey and neat, was catching the ambient light. On the polished marble table in front of her sat her old, woven volunteer picnic basket, containing the empty glass jars of homemade vegetable broth. It was me. Vanessa blinked, looking from me to the empty soup jars, her face contorting into a mask of pure, unadulterated confusion and disgust. "Ethan, what is this?" she stuttered, her influencer voice cracking completely. "Why is your mother sitting in the chairperson's seat? Why is this unhygienic old volunteer at the executive table? Where is the billionaire owner of the endowment?" I didn't raise my voice. I didn't stand up. I reached into my old basket, picked up one of the recycled glass jars, and set it down on the white marble table with a soft, definitive thud. "You are looking at the owner, Vanessa," I said, my voice carrying the calm, absolute weight of a head nurse, delivering a terminal diagnosis. Ethan stumbled backward, his knee catching the edge of a leather chair as his face turned the color of ash. "Mom," he whispered, his voice trembling so violently he could barely articulate the word. No, that's impossible. The Avery Vance Endowment is a private healthcare trust from Delaware. They funded my entire medical residency. They paid for my private laboratory grants. They built the $50 million pavilion. I built the pavilion. Ethan, I said softly, looking directly into his bloodshot eyes. Your grandfather, Dr. Silas Avery, created the foundation of your entire career. And for 40 years, I protected that wealth, rooting it through an anonymous trust, so that you could learn the true value of human life. I gave you a baseline because I loved you. I leaned forward across the marble table, my expression entirely unyielding, as Marcus Vance slid a stack of formal, gold-leaf restructuring documents across the stone, right against my son's shaking fingers. "But you forgot how to count. Ethan," I whispered, the room completely freezing. "You thought medicine was a luxury brand, and you treated your mother like a public relations inconvenience. So tonight, old Marge is going to teach you your very last lesson." The high-stakes boardroom was suddenly entirely quiet. The heavy breathing of the hospital trustees and the distant, muffled hum of the ballroom below were the only sounds left in the room. Ethan slowly lowered his hands, his fingers trembling as he looked down at the gold-leaf legal documents resting on the marble table. His $3 million lifestyle, his elite status, and his pristine medical reputation were now entirely variables in an equation I controlled. "Mom," Ethan whispered, his voice hoarse, completely stripped of his arrogant corporate armor. "What? What do you want? What does the endowment want me to sign? To restore the $50 million to the hospital?" "I am not a corporate raider, Ethan," I said, my voice completely calm as I pointed to the empty glass jar of vegetable broth. "I am a head nurse, and I am here to perform an emergency operation on your moral compass." Marcus Vance stepped forward, unscrewing a heavy black fountain pen and placing it directly on top of the restructuring agreement. "These terms are non-negotiable, Dr. Vance," Marcus announced coldly. "First, you will formally and permanently withdraw your nomination for Chief of Surgery. You are contractually unfit to lead a sanctuary for the sick. Second, to keep your private aesthetic clinic from facing a full institutional ethics board investigation, you will sign over 40% of your private surgical hours permanently. For the rest of your career, you will perform free reconstructive surgeries for breast cancer survivors and low-income trauma patients." Vanessa let out a sharp, choked gasp, looking at the pen as if it were a weapon. "Ethan, no, you can't sign that. 40% of your hours for free. That will destroy our profit margins. We won't be able to afford the penthouse lease. My brand—" "Silence, Vanessa!" Ethan snapped, his voice cracking with absolute desperation. He looked at me, seeing the unyielding, silver-grey determination in my eyes. He realized that the low-income mother he had hidden next to the restrooms was the only person standing between him and absolute, professional ruin. With a shaking hand, he picked up the heavy fountain pen and signed his name on the dotted line. It was 10 o'clock on Friday night, 24 hours after the Wall Street and Medical Board storm had subsided. The media was already running headlines, but not the ones Vanessa had planned. The internet was flooded with clips of her disastrous live stream, exposing her cruel mockery of an elderly hospital volunteer who turned out to be the multi-million-dollar savior of St. Jude's. Her corporate sponsors vanished overnight. Her followers turned into a roaring crowd of critics, and her curated, elite image dissolved into absolute, digital ash. I stood on the quiet, open-air balcony of the new Oncology Research Pavilion, looking out at the sweeping Manhattan skyline at twilight. The air was crisp, and the falling snow looked like tiny crystals under the streetlights. I wasn't alone. Resting on the stone ledge next to me was my grandfather's old, weathered medical case and an empty, recycled glass soup jar. To the world, The elite medical district below was a place of high finance, luxury penthouses, and expensive lifestyles. Ethan believed his worth was determined by the price of his consultation fee and the brand of his sports car. But as I stood there, wearing my faded grey-knitted cardigan, holding the cold stone railing, I knew the true valuation of our family's legacy. It wasn't found in a $10 million penthouse. It was found in the quiet, operating rooms where dying people were given a second chance at life. It was found in the simple, honest sacrifice of a nurse's code, where 2 + 2 always equals 4, secrets always unravel, and karma never misses an address. I walked back inside the warm, dimly lit research wing, leaving the massive view of the city behind me. I set my grandfather's old medical case on the nurse's station desk, one last time. I ran my wrinkled fingers over the worn leather, lifting out the old stethoscope and the original handwritten formula sheets. Then, I reached into the hidden pocket beneath the dark silk lining at the bottom of the case. The secret compartment Ethan had never discovered because he was too arrogant to ever look at his family's history. Beneath the silk rested a simple, yellowed envelope. Inside was a hand-stitched certificate for a beautiful, fully funded medical clinic, nestled in a quiet, low-income valley in Switzerland, a place where advanced cancer research was conducted entirely for free, funded 40 years ago by my grandfather and me, our quiet, invisible safety net for the soul. We had built the wall that nobody could see, specifically to protect our family from the very storms that Ethan had courted in his search for vanity. We knew what true healing cost versus what a curated lie was worth. My son believed he was a medical king living in a modern castle. In reality, he was currently operating in a hospital whose foundation I owned. Gilded lies will always fracture, but the karma found in true humility is eternal. Grab a quiet cup of tea, protect your foundations, and remember, numbers never lie. This has been another deep chronicle from Til Lies Do Us part. We'll see you next week.